Well, welcome everyone, and a special welcome to Amanda Lynch, class of 2002. Amanda's been a really good friend to the Office of Alumni Engagement. She has had another session with us earlier, which we thoroughly enjoyed. And we are really excited about her presentation this afternoon, Psychological Resiliency for Children in a Post-Pandemic World. Amanda is a trauma-informed specialist at Greater Richmond SCAN and a best-selling author and founder of Rethink Resiliency. She is a licensed educator and an expert in trauma-informed practices and mindfulness in the classroom. Lynch began her work as a special education teacher in Richmond Public Schools in 2002. Amanda began practicing yoga in 2013 and instantly recognized the countless healing benefits yoga has to offer. She completed her RYT-2000 in 2019. As a native of Glen Allen, Virginia, she was very naive, but naive to the poverty and trauma that plagued many of her students and families. She sought out more information about substance use disorder, cultural responsiveness, and historical trauma as she navigated the systems and resources that could best support her students, both in and outside of the classroom. For nearly 20 years, Amanda worked in a variety of capacities in public education and briefly correctional education. It wasn't until 2006 when her best friend, Angel J. Jackson, and her father, Herbert Sharp Sr., were brutally murdered that she truly understood how deeply trauma could impact an individual and their family. This single event changed the trajectory of her career. And without further ado, Amanda, welcome. Thank you. And I'm going to cue you up and we're ready to roll.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm going to share my screen. I don't know where my glasses are, so I'm having trouble maneuvering around on the computer a little bit today. But I'm very excited to be here with you all. I am a 2002 graduate of Mary Baldwin. I also received my master's in teaching at NBC in 2006. And so I spent a long time working as a school teacher, really working with kids who were just in the throes of toxic stress. That led me into a career studying behavior and now trauma-informed specialist for Greater Richmond SCAN. And so I wanted to just touch on a few things today, discussing some of the psychological hurdles that many of our young people have faced during the pandemic. We'll also talk about trauma and the different types of trauma. Sometimes we don't think things can be a traumatic experience, especially if we ourselves have been exposed to certain situations, but just understanding that trauma is also subjective. Then looking at how it impacts our brain development and the behavior in children. Talking a little bit about the trauma-informed approach, and then what this looks like to implement some trauma-informed practices both at home and then in schools. So if you just want to check in with how you're feeling, and you can just drop this in the chat on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the worst and 10 being the best. I know for me, I'm probably somewhere in the middle. Been running around a lot with gymnastics and dance and all kinds of stuff. So I think I'm probably maybe at a 6 or 7, just trying to settle in. So Gabrielle is also at about a 7. Janice is also at a 7. I think many of us are right there in the middle. And then one thing I also try to encourage, either when I'm teaching students in yoga or the classroom or even my own kids, is to think about how you feel and where you're holding on to that feeling. And so for me, I will try to label my feelings. So today I'm feeling just a little anxious from running around so much. And I notice that that shows up in my chest. And so just for you, you don't have to drop this in the chat, but just think about a feeling or word that will describe how you're feeling right now in this moment. And then notice where that shows up for you. And if you find that what you're feeling is something you want to release or let go of, as we talk this afternoon, maybe jot down one of the strategies that we will cover and give yourself a moment or two to just practice that sometime today. And so I'm thinking about what trauma is. Trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual. It can be physical, emotional, it can be life-threatening, but all of these things have a lasting effect on a person's individual cognitive, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. It can be a real or perceived threat. So for example, if I get into a car accident, someone rear ends me, which happened to me this year in carpool, anytime someone is very close to me in the back, I may be on guard, right? And so that's not a perceived threat because the initial incident has already happened. It's also very subjective, related to an event and experience. The effect may be different. I use this example a lot. Divorce can be very traumatic for some children. I have a brother that's 11 years older than me, a sister that's 10 years older than me. I was 2 when my parents got divorced, where they were 13. I guess 13 and 12. And so their experience with my parents' divorce, much different. So recognizing that that can also be subjective. And so just thinking about some possible traumatic events that students, that children, grandchildren may experience might look like community and domestic violence. I mentioned being in an accident. I've worked with a family where the mother's illness was very traumatic for her children as she went through cancer. Being a witness to violence, even natural or man-made disasters. Being deployed, sometimes we don't think about the impact that that can have on young people as well. That can certainly be a stressor. Sudden loss of a loved one, oppression and racism. So just going through some of the list. And so our brains develop what they need to survive, right? And so I want you to just think about your brain. The bottom part of your brainstem, that's the only part of your brain that's fully developed when you are born, right? Everything else, your brain develops from bottom to top, happens through relationship and experience. So the pathways that you frequently use get stronger. So like that top part of the brain, which is responsible for planning, executive functioning skills, logical thinking, being able to control your emotions, that gets stronger through healthy relationship and healthy experience. Whereas our survival part of our brain, that gets stronger if you find that you are in more situations where you are being asked to survive some traumatic or maybe unhealthy things like abuse, trauma, right? So your brain is uniquely designed to survive the world that the person lives in. So a lot of times we're asking kids, young people, teenagers to pull from this top of brain, this thinking, learning part of our brain, when they simply don't have access to it because that bottom part is heavy or it's overdeveloped, right? The sensory part of their brain is more fully developed. And so just thinking about what trauma looks like in COVID-19 for young people. Last June, so about a year ago, 40%, and this information comes from the CDC, 40% of US adults reported struggling with mental health or substance abuse. It's been reported all over the place that lots of people were drinking, feeling like they were isolated, maybe using drugs that started off recreationally and turned into something more significant, right? Because they were home, many people lost homes, loved ones, jobs, and this is just the data for adults. So you can imagine that a lot of our young people would be struggling with some of this same isolation. I know I have 4 children. My oldest is 22. Then I have a 15-year-old daughter, a 7-year-old daughter, and a 4-year-old daughter. And this experience for each one of them has been very, very different. And I notice a lot of things have been different, largely because of the developmental stage that they have been in, right? So my son, who had to pivot away from college, come home right in the midst of his, he just turned 21, handled things very, very differently than my 4-year-old, right? Who was happy about being home with me. So just understanding again that this trauma may look different for one developmental stage than another, from one child to another as well. And so some signs that your child may need some support. And on the teenage side, some of these things are going to just be natural to where teenagers are, right? So like changes in mood, for example, that might be something that you noticed pre-COVID in a teenager, right? Because they can be a little moody, or at least my 15-year-old can be a little moody, right? But if you're noticing that your child is taking all their meals in their room, they're isolating themselves, but you're also noticing a change in behavior or changes in their friendship circles, noticing that they're losing interest in activities. So if your child is in sports and now they don't want to go to practice, they're not interested in. So you're noticing some things that are ways that they're displaying like withdrawn behavior. Or on the other end of that, they're starting to do things that may look like self-harm, running away, things like that. So noticing some of those signs. Insomnia can be another one. Sometimes insomnia can be a symptom of depression or anxiety. So noticing that as well. I have to check in with my 15-year-old rather often because she will stay up until the wee hours of the night doing homework. And so just making sure that that she sets some healthy boundaries on her time is really important for me. Noticing changes in appetite. So where you may have had a child who had a pretty healthy appetite pre-COVID, maybe noticing that they're overeating or undereating. Problems with memory and concentration is another one. Now, remember, we talked about memory, concentration, executive functioning skills being those top of brain strategies. And so maybe noticing that your child is forgetting things or having difficulty focusing. I already went through changes of appetite, changes in appearance. And so maybe you had a child who really cared about their appearance and hygiene, and you notice that some of those things have sort of fallen by the wayside. Now, again, some of these things are going to be natural teenage behaviors, but just noticing a change or an elevation or decrease in these behaviors. Again, lack of interest in schoolwork, extracurricular activities, making any type of self-harm statements. All of these are things that you're going to want to reach out to a pediatrician about. Maybe even think about therapy or talking to your child's school counselor if you're noticing any of these changes. Now, for infants and toddlers and young children, it may look a little different. So you might notice a backwards progression in milestones. So maybe a child was potty trained and they sort of regressed there. Maybe they were sleeping independently of you and they've sort of regressed in those areas. Noticing that they're fussy or irritable. Sometimes kids don't have the language because remember, all that's a top brain skill. So they may not have the language to say that, I'm struggling with virtual learning, that I'm 5, right? And so noticing those things. Having a hard time staying asleep. Noticing separation anxiety and clinginess. And then bedwetting would be another one. And aggression. And I would also add if a child is struggling in situations where they're being asked to play with others, if they're struggling there, that could also be a sign that you may want to provide some additional support. And our first stop would, of course, to be contacting your pediatrician. And so just looking at how we can reduce the long-term impact, each and every one of us has been impacted by COVID-19 in a very different way than the person that's beside us. So it could be that you had lost a loved one, maybe suffered some financial angst or situations there. I know for me, my girls have been in school since the very first day. And I felt like when the last day of school was earlier this week, like a ton of bricks had been lifted off of my shoulders, because that was extremely stressful for me, sending them to school every single day, not knowing what they might be exposed to. My girls were also very, very close to my parents. And so, with not being able to really be in their physical presence for almost a year, also caused my middle daughter, my 7-year old, a lot of anxiety, right? And so, just recognizing and giving yourself grace that COVID-19 has been hard to adjust to for everyone. And so, some things that you can do and ways that you can help. In my work as a trauma specialist, I look to the four R's of trauma in just about everything that I do. And so, recognizing the impact of the trauma and toxic stress that has been caused by all of the residual things of COVID-19, realizing and then recognizing, also responding, and then resisting the urge to re-traumatize. And some of that may be for those of you who work with students or work with clients, but I did want to include all four. And so, realizing that we are not our behavior, or we are not our trauma, and that behavior in many instances is an inability to communicate in a socially accepted way, right? Because if I'm pulling from that downstairs part of the brain, I'm really not able to make decisions such as not being impulsive or being able to communicate how I'm feeling, right? And so, just understanding that in many instances, behavior is simply a coping strategy. So in our brain, we have two of these. They're called amygdala. One is over top of each of our ears, and they are about the size of an almond, right? And so they're responsible for the fight, flight, freeze part of our brain and behavior. And so if there's a threat that's either perceived or real, my amygdala is scanning the environment at all times. It's telling me I'm safe, or it's telling me you got to get out of here, you got to fight, you got to freeze, maybe even fawn, because that's a new one that some theorists are using as well. And all of that is a trauma response. We talked about our brains being heavy at the bottom. And so, just thinking about someone who has experienced trauma, and I would say that for the vast majority of us, COVID-19 has been a traumatic experience in some way, even if you don't recognize that it has been, right? Your body, I asked Dr. Eric Jensen, who is like the father of brain-based learning, could I trick my body into thinking that I'm not stressed out, right? So, like, I'm smiling, I'm still able to do things. And he's like, no, you can't trick your brain and body into not being flooded with hormones, right? So, even if you don't feel like COVID-19 has been very stressful, internally, it may have still caused you some angst. And so, recognizing that when there's a real or perceived threat, you may have an increased heartbeat, your breathing may increase, your vision and hearing become more accurate, because again, we're scanning the room. Our amygdala is like our security guard, so it's designed to protect us, and it takes time for those effects to diminish. So I also use this example quite often. My husband, when I'm angry, will say to me, you need to calm down, right? And so I will say, like, never in the history of the world has someone just calmed down because you told them to, right? So it's going to take time for your heartbeat to go back to normal. It's going to take time for your breathing to reset, for your vision and hearing to not be as acute. And so understanding that it's very healthy to have that fight, flight, freeze, and then putting in parentheses fawn response, because that response from our amygdala in our brain is designed to keep us safe. So again, recognizing those signs of trauma, we went through that list of things that you might see in young people, and then recognizing that some of the behavior that you might see is in response to trauma, whether it's COVID-19 or not. And then if you do have a child who you need to take to the pediatrician or talk to the school about some things that you're noticing, you want to make sure that the assessments or the social histories or whatever the school is giving you is able to capture adequately the information you're trying to convey. I also work for Boys and Girls Clubs of Metro Richmond as their trauma-informed specialist. So one thing we're doing for those of you who may work with students, we're looking at our application to see whether we can gauge some of this information. So has the family struggled with housing or food or those kinds of things over the past 18, 19 months so that we can better provide services for our families as well. And so then what might this look like at home or in the classroom? So it could look like verbal aggression, physical aggression, throwing objects, pushing, spitting. My girls are pretty close in age, my younger girls, and so I'm constantly having to, as the day goes, sort of referee between them. And so just recognizing if this starts to be a little more than what it was pre-COVID, that's probably something else I want to sort of dig a little bit deeper into. In terms of schools, seeing kids that might leave the classroom. So if you're getting calls from your child's teacher about any of these things, maybe talking again to the pediatrician about whether these things could be related to some unresolved anxiety or depression or isolation that came along with COVID, restlessness, excessive fidgeting, and then with freeze, shutting down, not responding, sort of like daydreaming, so escaping in your own mind, feeling numb. Those would be some signs with that. Then with fawn, another trauma response would look like being a people pleaser, not setting healthy boundaries, being afraid to say no. And so you don't want to disappoint someone. So maybe Susie has said, Amanda, can you come teach meditation to my women's group? And even though I know that I am overtaxed and overwhelmed with things, I don't want to disappoint Susie. And so that's also another trauma response. So even though our cameras are off, I really like this hand model of the brain by Dan Siegel. So I'm going to ask you to just hold your hand up. And I've done this activity with my youngest all the way to my oldest. So even I would say preschool age kids are very, very easy to understand this part of their brain. So we're going to pretend that our wrist is our brain stem, right? That's the base of our brain. Basic things like breathing, keeping your heart pumping, those are things that happen here. And remember, we said that's the only part of your brain that's fully developed when you're born. Everything else comes through experiences and relationships. So we're going to fold our thumb into the middle. And we're going to pretend like that's our amygdala. Now, remember, we said we have two of those, they're almond shaped. So we're going to pretend like that's our amygdala. That's our security guard. He's responsible or she's responsible for sensing danger and telling your brain and body. Then we're going to wrap our fingers around our thumb, and that's our prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that manages emotions and impulse, that can make complex decisions, right? That's the part that we want our colleagues, our spouse, our family, friends, kids to be drawing from this part of our brain, right? And so when we feel fear or danger or any type of intense emotion, anxiety, just feeling overwhelmed, our amygdala goes offline, right? And we flip our lid. And we talked about it takes time for our prefrontal cortex to wrap back in to let our amygdala know that we're safe. So when our brains are overwhelmed, when they're overwhelmed like this and you're flipping your lid, you're going to need a break to be able to reconnect. So with my youngest, we talk about flipping our lid. That's the language that we use. With my oldest, we'll talk about our amygdala misfiring, right? We want to wrap that back in, have our brain and body to feel safe. So how do we do that? We're going to treat the cause and not the symptoms, right? So we're going to treat what's underlying. So if you think about an iceberg, the tip of the iceberg is what we see. We see the behaviors, right? We see the misfire. We don't see all of the things that are underneath. So we may not see that this child struggled with virtual school, that this child lost a loved one to COVID-19, that this child lost their home or they missed their grandparents or their friend moved away because of whatever was going on during the past 19, 20 months, right? And so we want to respond. So if we work in an organization, we want to look at our mission statements, manuals, changes in language, making sure that all of those things are trauma informed. We want to respond to that downstairs part of the brain, to that amygdala, to our brainstem, right? We want to have those things feel safe, because when we can access that upstairs part of our brain, we're able to think before we act. We can make healthy decisions. We have control over our emotions and bodies because our brain feels safe. Our memory is improved. We have focus and good concentration. We're able to have empathy for others. And also, we're simply more self-aware. So some things that we can do, pretty practical strategies. With using my youngest daughter, when she's still in the terrific twos, sometimes even though she's 4. So when she's sort of flipping her lid, right? Because she'll flip her lid about anything. So when she's flipping her lid, the very first thing I say to her is, Rosie, my job is to keep you safe. I want you to be safe, right? So I'm offering myself almost as a helper to help her regulate her emotions. I'm wanting to be the weather in the room, right? So I don't jump into her storm. I'm going to pull her into my calmness. So I'm reaffirming for her that I want you to be safe, right? So then I'm connecting, I'm validating how she feels. And so my next step may be to say, Rosie, I want you to be safe. You seem to be having some big feelings. You seem pretty frustrated right now, right? Sometimes she'll say, no, mad, and so, okay, well, I'm gonna validate that. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be upset, right? So I'm relating, again, I'm pulling her in to my weather instead of becoming her storm. And then that final step, a lot of times we jump right into this final step. We want kids or colleagues or whoever to be able to jump right up here to that top part of our brain, right? So now we're going to offer some help. Rosie, my job is to keep you safe. You seem to be pretty frustrated. How can I help, right? So that prefrontal cortex is starting to wrap back around that amygdala through the process of regulating, relating, and reasoning. Again, acknowledging their feelings, low and slow. So I'm not screaming and yelling. I'm not, frustrated and slamming the door and, doing all of the things that we can sometimes do as the adult because we're feeling triggered. So you want to minimize talking as well. And this process of co-regulation or pulling her into my weather. So I'm not saying everything to Rosie that I've been thinking all day because I'm minimizing that talking and I'm allowing her brain to come back online, right? Another thing you can do is to get the person moving. So maybe taking a walk, swinging is really good for helping to reset. Any type of bilateral movement. And so maybe having an opportunity to stand up. I'm too close to the wall on the side, but putting your right arm out to touch your left foot, your left arm out to touch your right foot. And so crossing the midpoint of your body. Even doing alternate nostril breathing. This is a big one for me. I do this a lot in the car, or I will hide from my girls by going in the bathroom and you're plugging your right nostril and inhaling through your left, and then plugging your left nostril and exhaling through your right. And so you're literally, I call this cowabunga hand, but you're literally just alternating the way you're breathing. And it's a very, very quick reset for me. Anything that you can do in terms of engaging the senses. So whether it's something that's repetitive or patterned, tapping on the desk, anything like that, having weighted blankets. If you don't have a weighted blanket, you can buy those at Target, but you can also put like bean bags or books in a backpack and have a child sit with that. Offering gum, fidgets, music, anything like that will also help to redirect or reset your brain. My kids like to take ice cubes and melt them on their tongue. So that's a nice little reset. I have bags. Normally, pre-COVID, I had bags in my mindfulness room that had cotton balls in it where I might put the smell of curry. So I might sprinkle some curry or put lemon extract or vanilla, things like that, and would have kids smell and try to guess the scent. And then also, once they guessed, so if someone said, "Oh, this is lemon," right? Because I put lemon extract in there, having them be able to think about a memory that's associated with that, a positive memory. So I would have people say, "Oh, this makes me think about baking," or "it makes me think about pine sol and cleaning." And so that's another way to help regulate and reset your brain. So again, anything that goes to those five senses, even dimming the lights, is also very helpful. So with breathing exercises, you can have kids blow bubbles. There's a little star breathing thing that you go around the edges of the star to do that. Same thing with the pinwheel, blowing up a balloon. Those are all things that you can do. I have some paper that you can write down your feelings and you can light it like the adult would have to do this, obviously, but you can light it on fire and the paper will go up and sort of disappear so that you're not doing balloon releases anymore. But all of those kinds of things also to help engage the senses. Any type of grounding activity, so using your five senses to look around the room, doing this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 activity that's pictured on the right, offering mints, gum, cold water. I have a diffuser for aromatherapy. These are all things that we just offer in our household. So my kids have all kinds of sensory items in the back seat because it helps them to, number one, not be as loud as they sometimes can be, but it gives them something to do that's not a tablet or, computer or something in the car. I always have soft music in the background when I'm working because it helps me to stay focused and also helps me to not feel anxious when I'm doing things like this. And so, if that's you too, having some music that you have just playing in the back, and then also offering noise counseling headphones. Another grounding activity is simply to give someone space. And so my girls know that if they're feeling overwhelmed or they're flipping their lid, then they can go in their rooms and come out when they're ready, and we just give them space. And so thinking about what's happened to someone versus what's wrong with them is a pretty big shift in language and mindset. And so being comfortable with that as well. And again, this is a little more geared towards those of you who might work in mental health or work in the school system. But sometimes those spaces can be triggering when we're having kids constantly retell a story. And so just looking at the way that we also do business to make sure that we're not re-traumatizing those that we work with. And so we're wanting to help young people feel safe. And so some things that you can do to set them up for success there is having predictable routines and schedules. And so for my little one, my 4-year-old, she has a really, really hard time with changes in our schedule. And so sometimes I will have to say, we have an oops card. So if ballet is canceled, then it's oops, we're going to do something else. And so talking to her about that, because that seems to be something that really melts her down. Having that up in the house is really helpful. We have a whiteboard downstairs where our schedule for the week is. I have a calendar next to me. There's a sign on my door so that my girls don't interrupt when I'm doing things like this, but it tells them what I'm doing. And there is an option for them to ask their sister or to text me instead of coming in. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's pretty clear and it's visually posted. And then just making sure that even for like timers and visual reminders, these are certainly things you can do at home as well. My girls like to watch a video it's like a song, it's like clean up the room, but it has a timer on it. It's on YouTube. And that's like the only way I can get them to clean up. And so playing that is also an opportunity for them to have a visual reminder and timer of what they're supposed to be doing. So you want to make sure that you are open and honest with your students, with your children, within your family, allowing young people to be a part of their own decision making. So for Rosie, she likes to wear dresses every single day, but sometimes there's either not a dress available that she likes, or maybe she's doing something at school for the day that will require her to have on shorts, and so that's giving her choice as well, right? So you still can wear the dress, but you also know that you have to wear shorts. And sometimes I will give her two dress options so she can pick one. I've picked those clothes out, so it's a forced choice almost. Same thing with dinner. They don't always want to eat when I'm eating. So if I'm eating salmon, my girls probably want chicken nuggets. And so giving them like an alternative to that, right? Because it's really not that big of a deal. Allowing students and children to be a part of the conversation, right? Rather than just always saying you have to do this because I said you have to do it, um, and letting them have some expressive choice and voice in that too. So just reminding yourself to not take it personally. I find that a lot of things go wrong in my household because of my own stuff and my own ego, right? And so when I was growing up, the rule was if you don't eat what mom makes, then you just go to bed, right? And so for my kids, I've made a different choice, right? Because who wants their child to go to bed hungry because they don't like what's being served? And so for me, that's teaching unhealthy eating habits. You're sort of forcing kids to eat beyond what they want. And so, for me, it's you take a bite and we try new things. And if you don't like it, then you can get some fruit or a vegetable, right? And so just recognizing when I need to check my own ego and do my own inner work is very, very important as well. So understanding that self-care is not optional, that it's a necessity. And there's a difference between self-care and self-soothing activities. And so getting a cup of coffee that, from a coffee shop that you haven't been to in a while, taking a bubble bath, those really aren't self-care activities. They're more like self-soothing. So there's something that you can do pretty quickly that may help you to reset in the moment. But it's not like getting a cup of coffee is an investment that I'm making into myself. So maybe doing yoga, maybe committing to walking or doing meal prep, those would be more in line with self-care, right? So you can also create a self-care plan and then stick to it. So maybe even getting an accountability partner to help you focus on some goals that you've set for yourself. One thing that I did, I'm like awful about losing things. So I lost my Fitbit a couple of months ago, but my kids and husband got me a new one for Mother's Day. So I'm using that to sort of hold myself accountable to taking a set number of steps every day, to making sure I'm getting enough sleep, to making sure I'm walking 250 steps every hour during the workday. And so that's all things that I know that I can just use a Fitbit for accountability. But it would also be great to just have an accountability partner. You can't give what you don't have, right? And so allow yourself to also be poured into. It's really hard for me to ask for help pre-COVID because I felt like I should have it all under control. Well, I quickly had to give myself grace there and let that go. And so just making sure that you are also allowing yourself to be poured into. And every part of that overflow from your cup is for other people. But what's inside your cup is just what's for you. I also linked Greater Richmond Scans YouTube page. We have lots of read alouds for kids. We have lots of meditation and very short take 5 activities. So if you're interested, you can pull those things up. And recognizing that recovery is possible, that a strong relationship with at least one competent, caring individual outweighs any type of trauma that you could have experienced, right? We all want to be loved and we all want to feel connected to other people. And so maybe finding a mentor or a model for yourself, but also your kids or grandparents. If you notice, I believe that all kids have gifts And so if you notice that your child or grandchildren are really interested in reading or really interested in gymnastics or dance or whatever it is, sort of nurturing those things and allowing kids to feel like they have some control over their own lives and that they belong to a community. So just a quick recap. So shifting from focusing on what happened to you versus what's wrong, not focusing so much on negative behaviors, but thinking pretty intentionally about what's contributing to those behaviors. So what's causing Gabrielle to cry before bed, right? And so thinking about that. So really promoting and building healthy, protective relationships and factors around kids and ourselves, rather than focusing on the risk factors that someone may have. Also thinking about the impact that trauma has on staff, on yourself, on parents, to make sure that we're creating those safe working environments. Many of us are still working from home, so making sure we have those safe spaces within our homes as well. When we first started with our remote working, I was working in my bedroom and I didn't invite my colleagues to come home and see my room. And so that shifted to me creating, I call this the Zen Den, but creating sort of a space where I have my books and I have my singing bowls and yoga mats, and I also do work out of this space. And so creating that atmosphere for myself. And then again, if you are allowing for that voice and choice, letting kids also give you feedback and take the lead on some things at home as well. I have lots of resources here at the very end, ranging from meditation links to articles about mental health, stress and anxiety in young people. There are some tips for parents as well. And then I just Googled movement break because it's also really important that we get up and move. And so if you click on that link, it'll pull up like hundreds of movement breaks on YouTube. We are big Just Dance fans here, so that's normally a break for us. But if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to unmute yourself or to drop them in the chat.
Amanda, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
This is super helpful. I'm wondering, as you think about people who have had repeated trauma and are older, more like young adults, but seem very young for their age, it seems like a lot of these things, obviously in a more sophisticated fashion, would be useful as well. I just wondered what you think about that.
Absolutely. So a lot of this for adults really requires inner work. And for me, I'm an expert at myself, so I can just share like some of the inner work that has worked for me. Yoga and meditation have been, especially meditation, have been just really life-changing and affirming for me. So I teach meditation pretty often. I also teach restorative yoga. And so those things, restorative yoga in particular, really help to engage like the rest and reset part of your body. And so I need that all the time because I have a business, I have 4 kids, my kids are in dance, gymnastics, and this and that. And so, but I always